Screams shattered the airwaves. "Help me! He's here! Please!" The boy's voice cracked, raw with terror. The sound of heavy breathing and chaotic movement crackled through the dispatcher's headset. "Calm down," she said coldly, her tone devoid of urgency. "What's the problem?" He's trying to break in," the boy stammered. A loud crash came through the line, followed by a scream. "Please, he's got a knife." "I'm all alone." The dispatcher sighed audibly, rolling her eyes. "You're alone? Where's your mama? She's at work. Please, I'm begging you." "Look, kid," she interrupted, her voice clipped. "This line is for real emergencies. Deal with it yourself." The line went dead. Welcome to Incredible and Teachable Story, where we bring you gripping tales that highlight the harsh truths of society and the importance of standing up for what's right. Today's story is one of heartbreak, injustice, and the devastating consequences of negligence and racism. If you believe every child deserves to be heard, no matter their race or background, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Only those who turn a blind eye to injustice would choose not to subscribe. Be part of the change. Subscribe, like, and share this story to spread awareness and fight against the systemic failures that cost lives. Because staying silent in the face of racism is just as bad as being a part of it. The house stood eerily silent under the flashing red and blue lights, its broken front window yawning like a wound. Detective Marcus Rowe ducked under the yellow crime scene tape, his breath visible in the cold night air. The murmurs of neighbors clustered on the sidewalk blended with the crackle of police radios, creating an unsettling symphony of grief and chaos. Inside, the living room told a story of terror. The modest furniture was overturned, a shattered lamp lay in pieces, and a trail of blood stretched across the worn wooden floor. In the center of the room, Deshaun Parker's small, lifeless body was curled in a defensive position, his hands clutching the remnants of a broken chair leg. "Detective," a young officer called, his voice unsteady. The coroner's initial report, multiple stab wounds. The boy fought back, but... His voice trailed off as he glanced at the body. Marcus nodded grimly, crouching beside the boy. Deshaun's wide eyes were frozen in fear, a haunting reflection of his final moments. Beside him lay a phone, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. Marcus reached for it, careful not to disturb the evidence. "Did he call 911? Marcus asked, his voice low and taut. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "The call came in 4 hours ago, but..." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "It wasn't prioritized." Marcus's jaw tightened as he stood, his mind racing. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes catching details others might miss. A bloody handprint on the doorframe, a single shoe left near the entryway. Marcus clenched his fists. Deshaun's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a failure, one he intended to make right. Karen Sutton sat at her desk in the sterile, fluorescent-lit dispatch center, sipping her third cup of coffee. She yawned, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. The glow of the monitors around her cast an indifferent light on her face. To her, it was just another shift. Calls came in and calls went out. It was a cycle she had grown numb to over the years. Across the room, colleagues chatted quietly, occasionally exchanging a laugh to drown out the monotony. Karen joined in, recounting a minor mishap with a caller earlier that evening. "Kids said someone was breaking in," she said with a chuckle. "Told him to deal with it. Probably just some stray cat." The laughter died when the door to the dispatch center swung open with a bang. Detective Marcus Rowe strode in, his face carved from stone. The air grew heavy, and the room fell silent. Karen froze, her coffee halfway to her lips. "Karen Sutton," Marcus said, his voice cold enough to chill the room. "You took a call from Deshaun Parker tonight, a boy who begged for help." He dropped a file onto her desk, the impact making her flinch. "He's dead now. Care to explain why that call wasn't prioritized?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The weight of Marcus's glare pinned her to her chair. I didn't think it was serious," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "It sounded like a prank or something." Marcus leaned in, his eyes blazing with anger. "A prank? He's dead because you decided to play judge and jury from your desk. This isn't over, Karen, not by a long shot." As Marcus walked away, the murmurs began. Karen sat frozen, her heart pounding. For the first time, she realized the gravity of what she'd done, or failed to do. Tamika Parker was finishing her double shift at the hospital when her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. She ignored it at first, too focused on finishing her rounds, but when her supervisor approached her, face pale and trembling, Tamika's stomach dropped. "You need to sit down," the woman said softly, holding out the phone. "What's going on?" Tamika demanded, her voice tight with worry. She took the phone, her hands trembling as she pressed it to her ear. "Miss Parker," a police officer began on the other end, his tone grave. "There's been an incident involving your son, Deshaun. You need to come home immediately." The world around her blurred as she processed the words. Her son. Her baby. Without waiting for details, she tore off her badge and bolted from the hospital. The drive home was a nightmare. Her thoughts spiraled into dark places as she imagined every terrible possibility. When she arrived, the sight of flashing police lights and crime scene tape made her heart stop. "No!" she screamed, throwing open the car door and running toward the house. Officers tried to stop her, their hands outstretched, but she fought against them. "Let me through! That's my baby in there!" "Ma'am, please," an officer said gently, holding her back. "The detectives are working. You can't go inside." Tamika fell to her knees, her sobs loud and raw. Neighbors watched from their porches, their faces painted with pity and sorrow. Detective Marcus Rowe approached her cautiously, his hat in his hands. "Miss Parker," he said softly, kneeling beside her, "I'm so sorry. We're going to do everything we can to bring whoever did this to justice." But Tamika couldn't hear him. Her world had shattered, and all she could feel was the gaping void left by her son's absence. Detective Marcus Rowe stood in the Parker living room, now eerily silent, save for the occasional murmur of crime scene investigators. The chaos of the night was frozen in time. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and streaks of blood leading to where Deshaun had fought for his life. "We've got to piece this together," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. A small, bloodied sneaker near the doorway caught his attention. Next to it, the boy's phone sat cracked and lifeless. "Get that phone bagged," Marcus instructed one of the techs. "I want every call and message analyzed." He stepped outside into the biting night air as the techs continued their work. The faint glow of security cameras from neighboring houses gave him hope. "Canvass the area," Marcus barked to his team. "I want every camera within a 2-block radius pulled." Someone had to see or hear something. An hour later, Marcus stood in front of a monitor, watching grainy footage from a neighbor's porch camera. The timestamp matched the approximate time of Deshaun's desperate call to 911. The footage showed a hooded man loitering near the Parker home before slipping inside. Moments later, the boy could be seen running to the window, shouting something. Marcus clenched his fists as he watched the hooded figure reappear, dragging Deshaun back into the house. Back inside the Parker home, another investigator called Marcus over. "Found this in the kitchen." He handed Marcus a blood-smeared diary. Marcus flipped it open, his chest tightening as he read the last entry. "I'm scared. I hope Mama comes home soon." Marcus inhaled sharply. This wasn't just a break-in gone wrong. This was personal, and someone had to pay. The dimly lit interrogation room buzzed with tension as Marcus leaned over the table, his piercing gaze locked on the man seated before him. Trevor Haynes, a wiry figure with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck, stared back defiantly. His hands were cuffed and dried blood clung to his knuckles. "We've got you on camera, Trevor," Marcus growled, tossing a series of grainy photographs onto the table. Each one showed Trevor near the Parker residence that night. "You were there. You went inside. Don't bother denying it." Trevor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "So what if I was? Doesn't prove I killed anyone." Marcus's jaw tightened as he slammed a file onto the table. "You broke into the house. A 12-year-old boy is dead because of you. This isn't just trespassing, it's murder." Trevor's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Look, man, I don't know what happened to that kid. I needed cash, okay? Thought the place was empty. Things went sideways." "Sideways?" Marcus hissed, leaning closer. "You stabbed a child, Trevor, a defenseless kid who begged for help. Don't you dare minimize what you did." For the first time, Trevor's eyes flickered with something like fear. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he mumbled. He fought back. "I panicked." Marcus felt a wave of anger rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You didn't just hurt him, you took his life, and we'll make sure you pay for it." As Trevor's bravado crumbled, Marcus left the room, his mind racing. This was only part of the puzzle. Why had Deshawn been targeted? And why hadn't his desperate call for help been answered? The answers lay just out of reach, and Marcus was determined to find them. Karen Sutton sat stiffly in the brightly lit conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The murmur of voices around her, detectives, supervisors, and representatives from internal affairs, pressed down like a crushing weight. She had been summoned to explain her decision during the critical hours of Deshawn Parker's call for help, and the air was thick with judgment. Detective Marcus Rowe entered the room, his expression unreadable, but his steps heavy with purpose. He placed a recording device on the table and hit play. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice echoed in the room, professional but detached. A child's voice responded, shaky and urgent. Please, someone's trying to break in. I'm alone and I... Calm down, Karen interrupted. Are you sure it's not just a neighbor or an animal? Where's your mom? The boy's voice cracked with fear. She's at work. Please, he's coming in. Karen's recorded sigh filled the room, followed by her curt reply. Look, kid, if it's that bad, you need to figure out a way to stay safe until your mom gets home. The recording stopped abruptly, and silence fell over the room. Karen shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the collective stares. I thought it was a prank, she stammered. We get so many prank calls from kids. I didn't think it was real. Marcus leaned forward, his voice cold. That's your excuse? A boy died, Karen. He died waiting for help that never came because you couldn't be bothered to do your job. Her supervisor slammed a hand on the table. Karen, this is beyond negligence. This is a failure of humanity. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending further investigation. As Karen left the room, her face pale and drawn, Marcus watched her go. For Deshawn, this wasn't justice, but it was a start. The streets of the Parker neighborhood were no longer quiet. News of Deshawn's tragic death had spread like wildfire, igniting anger, grief, and a burning call for justice. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the once peaceful cul-de-sac was transformed into a hive of activity. Neighbors gathered near the Parker home, laying flowers, lighting candles, and leaving heartfelt messages on a makeshift memorial at the base of the mailbox. A large photograph of Deshawn, smiling brightly in his school uniform, stood at the center of the tribute, surrounded by flickering candles. Tamika sat on her porch, her face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. She hadn't slept, her mind haunted by memories of her son's laughter and the cruel reality that she would never hear it again. Friends and family surrounded her, offering their condolences, but no words could ease the ache in her heart. The local church pastor, Reverend Ellis, stood on the front lawn, addressing a growing crowd of community members and news cameras. His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke. Deshawn Parker was a child, innocent, full of promise, and deserving of protection. But our systems failed him. We cannot stay silent. We must demand accountability and ensure this never happens again. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices united in chants, "Justice for Deshawn. No more silence." Social media exploded with hashtags like #Justice for Deshawn and End Racism Now. Videos of the community rallying outside the police department gained traction, with thousands sharing their outrage over the 911 dispatcher's callous response. Inside the Parker home, Marcus watched the crowd through the window, determination hardening his features. The community's anger fueled his own resolve. They had lost a child, but Marcus vowed they wouldn't lose the fight for justice. Detective Marcus Rowe gripped the steering wheel as the unmarked car sped through the narrow streets of the city. The air was thick with tension. He could feel it radiating from his partner, Officer Joanna Cruz, seated beside him. "Are we sure it's him?" Joanna asked, her voice sharp and urgent. "Positive," Marcus replied, eyes locked on the GPS tracker on the dashboard. "Trevor's been spotted near the old industrial district. If he's running, it's because he knows we're closing in." The radio crackled. "Suspect last seen heading west on Harlow Avenue. All units proceed with caution. Subject is considered dangerous." Marcus slammed his foot on the accelerator, weaving through traffic. As they approached the industrial zone, the desolation of the area was palpable. Abandoned factories loomed like silent sentinels, their broken windows reflecting the flashing blue and red lights of pursuing squad cars. "There?" Joanna shouted, pointing to a figure darting between the shadows of a crumbling warehouse. "Trevor." Marcus skidded to a stop, and both officers bolted from the car, drawing their weapons. "Trevor Haynes!" Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Stop! You're surrounded!" But Trevor wasn't about to surrender. He ducked into the warehouse, slamming the rusted door behind him. Marcus and Joanna followed, their footsteps echoing in the vast, dimly lit space. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. Trevor's shadow flickered between the machinery, a phantom in the gloom. Marcus signaled for Joanna to circle left as he moved right, methodically closing the gap. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, followed by Trevor's frantic footsteps. "He's panicking," Joanna whispered through her radio. "Good," Marcus replied, his jaw tight. "Because he's not getting away this time." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Trevor Haynes began. Rows of spectators filled the benches, a mix of journalists, activists, and community members who had rallied for justice for Deshaun Parker. Tamika sat in the front row, flanked by her sister and Reverend Ellis, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. Her eyes never left the defendant's chair. Trevor entered, shackled and flanked by officers, his face pale but defiant. The murmurs grew louder until the judge's gavel brought the room to order. "This court is now in session," Judge Amelia Reed announced, her stern gaze scanning the room. The prosecution wasted no time. Assistant District Attorney Valerie King approached the jury, her voice steady but impassioned. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Trevor Haynes deliberately targeted Deshaun Parker. This was not a random burglary. It was an act of violence that left a young boy dead and a community shattered. We demand accountability." Valerie methodically laid out the case, presenting security footage, forensic evidence, and Deshaun's bloody diary. The jury sat in rapt attention as each piece painted a damning picture of Trevor's actions. Then came Tamika's testimony. Her voice cracked as she recounted the night of her son's murder, her grief palpable. "He was just a child," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He called for help, and no one came." Trevor's defense attorney attempted to shift blame, painting him as a man caught in desperation, not a killer. But his argument faltered when Marcus testified, recounting Trevor's confession and the evidence linking him to the crime. By the trial's end, the weight of the truth was undeniable. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Tamika exhaled shakily. The verdict would not bring her son back, but it could bring her a step closer to justice. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for Tamika. The courtroom's heavy silence, as the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts, still echoed in her mind. It was a small victory, but one that brought her no comfort. Deshaun was gone, and no amount of justice could fill the void he left behind. On a crisp morning, Tamika stood in her living room, staring at the dozens of condolence cards and flowers that had arrived over the weeks. The scent of lilies and roses filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of Deshaun's favorite cinnamon-scented candle. His presence lingered in every corner of the house, his basketball shoes still by the door, his school books untouched on the dining table. But Tamika knew she couldn't let herself crumble. She had a responsibility, not just to her son's memory, but to the community that rallied around her. Reverend Ellis's words rang in her ears. "Turn your pain into purpose." Determined, she reached for her laptop and began drafting a proposal. Tamika wanted to establish a foundation in Deshaun's name, one that would advocate for systemic reform in emergency response systems and offer support to families impacted by negligence and violence. Later that evening, she met with local activists at the church. "This foundation isn't just for Deshaun," she told the small gathering, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's for every child who was ignored, every family left to grieve, and every life that could have been saved." As the group pledged their support, Tamika felt the stirrings of hope for the first time in weeks. Her pain was still raw, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it fueled her mission, a mission to ensure her son's legacy would be one of change and resilience. Months had passed since the trial, but the ripples of Deshaun's story continued to spread. Across the city, reforms were being proposed, policies reevaluated, and training overhauled for emergency response systems. The Parker Foundation had gained traction, becoming a beacon of hope and change for families who had suffered similar losses. Karen Sutton, the disgraced 911 dispatcher, sat in a small church hall, surrounded by faces she didn't recognize. It was her first public apology meeting, arranged by community leaders as part of a restorative justice program. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly as she prepared to speak. When her turn came, Karen stood slowly. Her voice was unsteady, but the weight of her words carried through the room. "I failed Deshaun Parker," she began. "I failed his family, and I failed my duty. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I let my biases blind me to the urgency of his plea. And because of me, a child is gone." Tamika sat in the front row, her expression unreadable. It had taken immense strength to agree to this meeting, and now, hearing Karen's words, a mix of emotions swirled within her: anger, sorrow, and a faint glimmer of acknowledgement. Later, as the meeting concluded, Karen approached Tamika hesitantly. "I know I can't undo what I did," Karen said, her eyes welling with tears. "But I want to help. I want to make sure no other family goes through this." Tamika studied her, searching for sincerity. After a long pause, she nodded. "Then start by listening," she said softly. That night, as Tamika walked home, she reflected on the journey so far. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about changing the future. And for Deshaun's memory, that was a fight worth continuing. A year after Deshaun's death, the Parker Foundation hosted its inaugural event, A Voice for Change. The city auditorium buzzed with energy as hundreds gathered to honor his memory and celebrate the strides made in the fight for justice and reform. A large portrait of Deshaun stood on stage, surrounded by flowers and candles. Tamika stepped up to the podium, her heart heavy yet determined. Her voice rang out with strength as she spoke. Deshaun was more than a victim. He was a son, a friend, and a beacon of light in this community. His life was taken, but his legacy lives on in the change we've fought for together. The crowd erupted in applause, many wiping tears as Tamika continued. She announced scholarships for underprivileged youth, training programs for emergency responders, and a hotline that would ensure no child's call for help went unheard again. As the event concluded, Tamika looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of sorrow and hope reflected in their eyes. Deshaun's legacy was no longer just a story of tragedy. It was a movement for compassion, accountability, and change. And though her heart ached for her son, Tamika knew his voice would echo forever in the fight for justice.